I am MelissaAvery Weir, and my talk this morning is going to be on some simple accessibility techniques that front-end developers can use, perhaps without necessarily having to ask permission from design or line of business. So let's say you haven't gotten buy-in from your company yet to go whole hog on accessibility, but you want more support for screen readers, for a variety of other assistive tech. So I want to cover some of those techniques that we can do right now and just include in our coding standards. So we, as developers, are creators. We want to make a cool app or a cool library or cool whatever and share that with the world. That's for many of us, that's what gets us up in the morning. And we're empowered to do so. We have the skills, the training, or we are getting the skills and the training to be able to do that. So we are kind of in a unique position in which we can affect change in a way that consumers of the internet may not be able to. We are, however, constrained. We're constrained by time. We're constrained by money. We might be constrained by the culture of our workplace. You ask line of business, hey, can I do this? Can we change our design this way? Can we add these things to our site to make it more accessible? And they say, we don't have time for that. Disabled people are a minority. We have enough money, or we can get enough money through other means. And so you kind of go, oh, well, okay, this is what I deal with. And there are cases that you can build up to help convince your company, but that takes time, right? You need metrics. You need to talk perhaps to legal people. There's just a lot involved in that. But there are some things we can do right now. So I want to talk about what accessibility and disability covers, because it's broader than a lot of people think. We often think people that are deaf or hard of hearing, or we think of blindness as sort of the primary disabilities that we care about. But there are also neurological or cognitive issues or motor issues. So people who cannot use a mouse, people who are distractible, people with memory impairments. And many of us know somebody that has one of these problems. And that can be, like, notice here I'm looking at the effects of the problems, not the particular conditions, but this might be people with ALS, this might be people with ADHD, this might be people with Alzheimer's. Any number of conditions can produce these difficulties using the web. I think that the bare minimum for being a good person is a sense of compassion. Not only do you need to have the empathy to be aware of the suffering of another person, but you need to have the urge to relieve that in some fashion. We are creative and empathetic. You're probably not in this room, right? You see that someone has a problem, you want to make a tool for whatever that is. And we are empowered with the skills to do that. We can relieve that problem. Sometimes, though, when I talk about accessibility with folks, I've been told this. I, in fact, was told this when I woke up in the hospital after shoulder surgery, and I've got this sling on that fastens back here and fastens here, and I'm not going to be able to move my arm for 2 months, and I live alone. And I said, could you help me think of ways I can take this on and off by myself? And she says, you can't. Have someone help you. And I said, I need to bathe on the regular. And I got no help, none. We spent 15 minutes arguing about this in the hospital right after I wake up from anesthesia. And to scope this to the internet, if I have trouble dealing with a website, I'm technical, but if I have trouble dealing with a website, I'm not going to stop, go find somebody else, say, hey, let me borrow your time because this form isn't working the way it should. Could you help me with this? Or I can't see it, or whatever. I'm just going to leave. I'm just going to go find some other place where I can engage in what service I need. We value our independence. And that's a cultural thing to a certain extent. But as far as we can enable it, we want to help people have independence in using our products. So how do we do better? I picked 4 techniques, there are hundreds, I picked 4 that are a bare minimum. We can do better, we will do better, but we have to start somewhere. So I want to touch on examples of all of these, and then I will also touch briefly on some things that we can do that are more, especially once you have buy-in from the rest of your teams. So first, I want to talk about sort of semantic markup and ARIA. And ARIA is put out by the W3, so the HTML people. They provide roles to say, this is a banner, this is navigation, this is search, this is a forum. They provide state information, which is you can say this button has been pressed, this checkbox has been checked. And they provide an idea called live regions, where you can say, I'm about to update content right here. And that kind of can interrupt or notify users that something in this space is about to update, because that can be a difficult thing. So I'm going to focus on roles, because the other 2 can be more complicated to get right. So here's an example. We've got a basic HTML page. We've got a navigation bar, a banner, a navigation bar, and some main content. All you have to do is add some attributes. Say, this header is a banner. This nav is navigation. And what screen readers will do is they will announce these as landmarks. And I've got a video where I can show you kind of how that works and how that sounds. The second component of this is to use semantic markup. I feel like that's established, but use your headers, because those get announced. Use your lists. Use your HTML5 things. So like I said, screen readers will announce landmarks. Another component of that is users who have custom CSS in their browsers will get a proper experience. So if someone says, I never want my headers italicized because italics is hard for me to read, if you're using H1 through H6, they will have the experience they prefer to have. So JAWS is one of the really popular screen readers. Screen readers are not, JAWS at least, is not scoped to the browser. So when you install JAWS, it starts reading your entire operating system to you, which can be very alarming if you're not expecting it.
Banner landmark region started. Header/banner.
Thank you.
Region end. Navigation landmark region start. Heading level 3 nav/navigation. List of 2 items. Bullet visited link HTML5 only. Bullet HTML5 plus ARIA. List end. Navigation landmark region end. Main landmark region start. Heading level 1 content/main. Section/region landmark region start. Heading level 3 section/region. Article landmark region start. Heading level 5 article header.
So screen readers, for those of us who have never used them, feel very overwhelming. There's a lot of keyboard shortcuts involved. I've only spent a few hours with one, and I'm so used to alt-tabbing, switching tabs and everything, that it's reading parts of things before I can get around. But once one has the experience with it, you want to be able to provide this for them. They want to know what section of the page they're in. They want to know how many items in the list, how far they have to wait, if you can, skip sections. So these 2 things, small pieces, they don't add much weight to your page. A couple of attributes. Once you've got your layout in place for your HTML, you're probably going to have many of your roles already there. So you don't have to worry about how much more content am I pushing down the pipe. Our second technique is to connect content with descriptors of that content. So visual users have a visual context, we see this sentence, send me notifications every 10 minutes. Even though that form field is in the middle, we know the time units, we know what it's for, just from looking at it. When JAWS reads this aloud, and someone tabs into that input field, it says, send me notifications every edit 10. And then they have to navigate differently, or they don't know what the units are. So this is kind of a standard markup thing you would do. You'd throw a label in there, because labels are nice and accessible, and we know this. I think that's kind of default. And then you attach it to that input, but the minutes is left hanging out there. And RA has got a few different ways to deal with this. They have labels. They have something called labeled by, and they have described by. Labels are text labels for an object when there's nothing visual on the page that can describe it. So a classic example is you have two navigation bars. You have your primary navigation across the top. If you're doing your I-beam layout, you have your top navigation, and you've got your sidebar navigation over there that's secondary. There's probably nothing on the page, unless your blog is from 2002, that says primary and secondary. But you do want to label those navigations, and so you use an ARIA label for that and just put the string primary and secondary in there. Labeled by and described by are when you have ID references. So you have one or more pieces on the page that can describe this thing. Labeled by is for focusable elements typically, so your form fields, your links. Described by might be additional information about a field. So you've got an input field and something that you might put in a tooltip, right? Like a suggestion for format or what this field is for. Something that's a little longer would fall into described by, but your short, direct label is going to be in labeled by. Multiple IDs are read in sequence. So you can compose these descriptions for multiple things that are in context, perhaps, that a visual user might see directly around it. So if we look at this a different way, what I did here was I threw a span on the minutes and gave it an ID so that I can reference it. And on the input, I gave it a labeled by of the first piece, the item itself, and the unit of time, the minutes. So what JAWS says here is, send me notifications every 10 minutes, edit 10. And that's a much more pleasant experience. And this is very focused on screen readers. And so we think blind people. Screen readers are also used by people that are illiterate or people that have learning disabilities who need their information given to them in an auditory fashion. Our third technique is to provide text alternatives. This is one of those other sorts of things. Put alt attributes on your images. Used to be required, now not so much. Go ahead and go back to doing it. You want concise, accurate, non-redundant alt text. So if you have a blog post and the preceding paragraph is about how your cat Jackie pooped on the floor and you're mad, and then you have a picture of cat Jackie, you don't have to say, my cat Jackie that pooped on the floor. Say, Jackie the cat, right? There's enough context in the words around it. But if that image also has a function, you need to talk about that. So let's say, circa 1997, your nav bar is using images for the text. On that home image, the function of that is to go home. So your alt should be home. It's already a link. Your image is already an image. Do not put image of, do not put link to. The screen reader will say it's a link. They know it's an image because it's got either they're seeing it and they see a broken image icon and they see the text, or the screen reader will tell them that it's an image. Don't use title, the title attribute, as a text alternative. That's for witty things on comics, not for actual accessibility. For your charts and diagrams that might be posted as images, go ahead and put a concise description of what that is. So, chart of pet preference survey. 25% of people prefer cats, 35% prefer dogs, 40% prefer hedgehogs. That's your alt text. Just cram it in there. You don't need to be verbose. The last thing that is important probably falls outside of the realm of development. I've not met many developers who are also content creators, but if you are, provide closed captioning and transcripts. And that can be after your video, you have a link to transcript if you don't want it on the page, or you can add closed captioning tracks. Video Tag has support for this. YouTube is pretty good about this. If you can, provide those. So why provide text alternatives? Screen readers, again, if they are not seeing the content. If you're on a slow connection, you might have images disabled. Or the content on the page might be triggering, which means that it is content that might cause a psychological condition to uprise. So if you have anxiety, or you have some trauma, you have PTSD, any number of things, you might want to disable the images on an article so that you can read the content, but not have that shocking thing that will cause you problems. Our fourth technique is keyboard accessibility. And this one can get tricky. So if you have events that trigger on hover, on, mouse over, mouse out, whatever, typically things like tooltips are very commonly this. Also make them trigger on focus, because the way people that are only using keyboards are going to navigate is by tabbing through the page. So when they hit an input, whatever magic you have happening on hover needs to also happen on focus or blur. And I think, things like validation, we're already pretty comfortable using blur for that. On click, despite its name, isn't mouse specific. It fires on the default action for something. So if I am focused on a link and I hit enter, that triggers an on-click event. Functionality on your site needs to be keyboard accessible. So people who are only using keyboards might include people in text-only browsers, people who are using screen readers, or are not using mice and are using screen readers, so perhaps blind users, people with motor issues. Let's say you have a really bad trimmer. It is very difficult to use a drag and drop widget, especially given that the text is often small and your drag is often a very fixed 10 pixel space in which you must drop that thing. Sortables and draggables are the worst. They need to be able to access this by keyboard. And this is where you get into JavaScript widgets, and those can get complicated, right? We're used to jQuery UI. Some of us are using Kendo. I'm sure someone's probably still using YUI. jQuery UI is not accessible. They have, I don't think, any keyboard support at all. Very little ARIA support. What ARIA stuff they do have, I believe, is in their tabs, and it's not particularly done correctly or well. Kendo is surprisingly awesome. Many of their widgets have keyboard support, and they have on each widget there'll be link in their documentation that says keyboard shortcuts, and they'll show you the mapping on how to access those. Unfortunately, their drag and drop and their sortable does not. There's a company called SSB BART, and I include a link to that later. SSB BART has an example of how to implement a drag and drop sortable. They don't do it in a particularly pretty way, and rolling your own is one of those things that does take more time. So if you are dealing with drag and drop sortables, that might be something where you say, okay, right now we leave this not amazingly accessible, but we can cover 90% of the other interactive widgets on our page. You can, and there are not great examples of this, you can extend toolkits, you can capture key press events and provide your own event bindings and provide your own legends. You can say, when I press K, or when I'm focused on this jQuery UI element, and I press K, that puts me in a drag and drop mode, and the first one's picked. And you can kind of map those things out. Probably inclined to be buggy. I would say, thinking about the third-party JavaScript discussion yesterday, in which, let's say you've got something like Bazaar Voice included, and they scope their stuff pretty tight, but if you start capturing all key presses on the document and doing things with that, you're more likely to start colliding with some of your third-party elements or other functionality that you have in place. So widget libraries are tough. It's hard to get it right. You do the best you can. If you're already rolling your own, I don't know why, if you're already rolling your own, you have much more flexibility there in terms of adding your functionality. In terms of things like Bootstrap, which don't tend to have widgets as such, Bootstrap seems to be pretty easy. Like, you can add your ARIA content that you want to, your roles, add key press things. So that Bootstrap's pretty cool, but it's also pretty light, right? You're not dealing with such heavy things as accordions and so on. Simple techniques. Want to use semantic markup. We want to tie content to what describes it, and that includes links. Provide text alternatives, and ensure keyboard access. So how do we know if we're doing it right? If you don't have buy-in from your organization, you probably don't have a QA team buy-in also. So me walking down the hall and saying, hey, please install JAWS and make sure our site looks good. They don't have time, right? So things that you can do yourself as developers. You do a final check before, hopefully you do a final check before you send your stuff to QA anyway, and don't just commit and it compiled, so let's go. Navigate the site without a mouse. Unplug your mouse if you have that reflex. Can you complete every form? Can you see your validation messages? Does it properly return with validation messages that you can navigate? Can you navigate to any page? Can you close any modal? Can you complete a modal and have it behave properly? Test it. See what you can and can't do. Give yourself a custom style sheet. Every modern browser supports this, at least on desktop. Make a little thing, say I want all my headers to be purple, because purple is the coolest color in the world. And view your site, browse around. Is the right content purple? If your article titles are still black, you probably aren't using the right tag. Turn off CSS. I believe every browser supports this still. Just turn it off. See what your page looks like. This is particularly helpful if you're doing CSS3 things. Can you still use your page in a good fashion if it's just text? I didn't put this here, you can also turn off JavaScript. Surveys are showing that about 98.5% of people who fill out accessibility surveys are using JavaScript. So they've declared themselves that they are using JavaScript. But if you're using Angular or Ember or Backbone or some other monolithic thing that is creating your page for you, turn off JavaScript. Does your page load? Is there content on it? Content other than, sorry, you need JavaScript. This isn't Flash, right? There is a web accessibility evaluation tool put out by WebAIM, which is a very good resource for accessibility information. And essentially, you throw in a URL, and it does sort of a scan and says, oh, it'd be great if you added these roles here, or perhaps this access key, or any kinds of things. It will point those out. And that's a good starting place, or a good kind of high-level check-in to make sure that you haven't broken anything, and that you have just kind of covered the high-level bases. JAWS, which I've used in Windows, I don't know that they have a Mac version, has a 40-minute trial. And what happens after 40 minutes is you need to reboot your machine. So it's like, the old IE VMs when they expired. And 40 minutes is a long time, right? Especially for running through a site and seeing how it sounds. And like I said, this takes over your operating system. So it's very alarming. It starts talking from the beginning of the installer, and then you get talking all the way. You might only need to run that a couple times, just to kind of get a feel for how things sound, for how things feel, or you can keep it as a kind of a regular check-in, and that's a fun tool. So you've got techniques, you've got ways to check. This is assuming you cannot hire an accessibility consulting firm to come in, which would be awesome, but pricey. I challenge you to incorporate these. When you go to work on Monday and you are working on your code, does it have ARIA roles in it? Are you assuming that this text box in the middle of this sentence, or this text box that is absolutely positioned, perhaps, away from the thing that describes it, this tooltip that tells me why you need my social security number, I challenge you to look at those things. I also challenge you to include these in your standards. Make this your baseline. When a new developer comes into your team and they go, what's with these attributes? You describe what these attributes do, and it just becomes part of your culture. You begin to develop an inclusive culture in which these basic things, in the same way that different teams use definition lists or don't for certain kinds of things, like, oh, well, I'll put some divs in an LI or whatever. The same sorts of things that teams pick anyway. Pick being inclusive. Pick being basically accessible. So let's say you've been doing these things as you are starting to build this culture, and your dev team is like, hey, this is easy. What else can we do? Your design team, you've written your 20-page document saying, we can increase our sales by millions of dollars, and these are the stats on people who use this assistive technology. And you're starting to get buy-in from business, you're starting to get buy-in from designers. Here are some things you can do that extend beyond your team, or some more advanced, or perhaps equally simple, but I didn't pick them, development techniques. Some of the things that relate to design are dealing with font scalability. And I think we've seen some of that in some of the other talks, where you can look at your viewport height as a unit. You can deal in EMs or other more universally scalable font things, adding breadcrumb trails. Looking at the size of your interactive elements. Again, consider that person with a trimmer or a person using a headset mouse, and your submit button is 20 pixels by 20 pixels. And they are having to aim on this thing to submit the form, particularly if they're not keyboard savvy. Like as a developer, I'm very keyboard savvy, I'm shortcuts and all that. But lots of people aren't. They reach for their mouse and they click things. So make your inputs bigger. That's a hard thing to argue with design. Like I've worked with a fair number of designers, and sometimes, I mean plenty of times, there's a complete understanding there, right? Like we can make this thing 10 pixels bigger in every direction, and that's totally fine. We can work with this. But sometimes there's a certain precision, and this also touches on fonts. There's a certain precision they want in all browsers, pixel perfect. And that's a hard discussion to have, is to say, this is who you're hurting by doing this. When you start to look at sort of more business interests, things that will cost more money across the board, that's where you get into things like captioning and transcripts, where someone has to sit there and type out what's in that commercial or what's in that, I don't know, ALS bucket challenge, whatever. And of course, the longer the video, the more the cost, right? These can be tricky things to push. Almost all of them are helpful to a certain degree. And you will often need to pick your battles. And I hate to think of this as a conflict, right? Like we want, if you're trying to create a culture of inclusion, to then treat it as a battle is not a particularly healthy way to go about it. But the convincing process can be slow. And that might mean that you demo this. You install JAWS, call your design team over for a presentation, and say, this is our website. Here's how it sounds. It's really hard to navigate. Or, hey, everybody in the room, unplug your mouse. Tab moves you around, enter clicks links, go. And see what happens. And maybe they'll say, this is terrible. Maybe they'll say it's fine enough, and you get to kind of like work on that, because it's probably not. But some of these are hard design decisions to make. Some of these are hard business calls to make, and I think that you can incrementally work on that. And sometimes it takes a lawsuit. Not that you should bring one forth. But sometimes it takes a coalition of people saying, I can't use your service. You need to be accessible. And I want a lot of money from you because I was unable to do so. And sometimes that's the wake-up call, and you don't want that to happen, right? Like we all have a certain interest in the profitability of our companies. And that's not a good way to change a culture, is through fear. But you want to try and head that off by beginning to include some of these things. And there are certifications that you can get. You can reach a level of accessibility that is Section 508 compliant, or depending on if you work with the government or you care, you can kind of get these sorts of certifications in which they say these things must be met across all pages. And that can be hard. I've worked at Big Bank where they did do that. It was fascinating. We did not have to skimp on design to have that accessibility. And I think that's a key point. Because that's often a fear, is that you need to have a site that looks like it's from 1994, right? Like Dave Weiner or something. But that's not the case. You can have a perfectly modern looking site with your rounded corners and your parallax and still have it be accessible. So that's a nice convincing argument for designers. 4 really good resources. So ARIA, there's a lot of it. If you go to the ARIA page and look at their guidelines, you will go, holy crap, I can't do this. But when you start to look through, particularly the general section and the HTML section, it's not that bad. Some of it is repetitive. They talk about 3 or 4 different ways to use labeled by. They talk about a couple different ways to use described by. And so out of 20 bullet points, that's a 4th of them, right? If you are doing Flash or Silverlight, or you are interested in server-side tech, they have guidelines for that as well. So you need to have keyboard shortcuts in your Flash application or your Silverlight application. And that's very helpful. Again, you may not be able to do all 30 of those, but you can pick what's appropriate for your team that you can implement in a healthy fashion without having to ask permission. WebAIM is a more, I tend to think of it as more article-centric. They have done several surveys of folks that are using assistive technology and kind of collated what browsers are they using, what disabilities do they have, kind of why and what's inclusive and accessibility. And they have some high-level guidelines in order to help with that. Wave, I mentioned, there are a bunch of tools for this. So if you need to check how is the color contrast on my site, particularly dealing with colorblind folks, like I have these 2 shades of orange, or I have an orange and a red right next to each other. That can be fine, but what's the contrast between those? Because that's what matters. Is this red different enough from this orange? And that's kind of a design thing, right? Like you might be able to push back and say, those 2 greens are way too close. But if that's the branding, right? Like there are any number of things that can complicate that. But there are tools for these. You can Google accessibility tools and you will just get pages and pages of them of varying degrees of usefulness, but you can kind of start to weed out what you're looking for. And then the SSB BART group, I've met one of the folks that works for them. They helped hold an accessibility meetup here in Charlotte. And they do some pretty amazing work. So this group is the one that has an implementation of Sortable and an implementation of drag and drop that is completely keyboard accessible. And like I said, it's probably one of the ugliest things I've ever seen. But that's okay, that's a secondary issue, that's all CSS. But they have, in their blog, they have a bunch of articles. They do a complete assessment of jQuery UI. They talk about Dojo, for instance. And they are essentially a consulting firm that gets hired. I think they've worked with Bank of America. They've worked with several other groups to come in and assess their accessibility. So 4 great places to take a look and kind of read up on these things and see what you can do that is above and beyond and how you can start to create that culture, because it doesn't hurt. It only helps to include more people. Even if your service is completely free, you run I make a granny squares color pattern generator. If someone who cannot see can use it, that is more helpful. It doesn't hurt anybody else. So I think we only have a couple minutes left, but if anyone has any questions. Oh, thank you.